Many months had passed since Starlight Beacon's dedication ceremony, since he had stood alongside his fellow Jedi, since he had stood alongside Avar Kriss. The eyes of the galaxy had been upon them in their temple finery, that damned collar itching as he listened to the speeches and platitudes, first from Chancellor Lena So, leader of the Galactic Republic, and then from Avon his Avon, the hero of Hetzel. The beacon was their promise to the galaxy, Avar had said. It was their covenant. He could still hear her words. Whenever you feel alone, whenever darkness closes in, know that the force is with. You know that we are with you. For light and life, for light and life. But that hadn't stopped the darkness from closing in later that day. A wave of pain and suffering, a vision of the future too terrible to comprehend. He had staggered, grabbing hold of a rail, blood gushing from his nose as the pressure in his head threatened to split his skull. What he had seen had haunted him ever since. It had consumed him. Jedi dying one by one, picked off by a twisting, unfathomable cloud. Stellan, Avar, everyone he had ever known in the past, and Evarioni he would meet in days to come. Faces both familiar and strange, torn apart. And the screams. The screams were the worst. He had made it through the rest of the evening in a daze, going through the motions, not quite present. The echo of what he had seen, what he had heard, burned onto his mind's eye. There had been mistakes. A few too many glasses of Patadon rose at the reception. Avar asking for that dance she'd mentioned. Elzar leaning in a little too eagerly, a little too publicly. He could still feel her hand on his chest, pushing him back. Hell, what are you doing? They had argued, privately, his head still spinning. We're not Padawans anymore. It had been months since he saw her again, and when he did, the atmosphere was as frosty as a dawn on Vander. Avar had changed toward him. She was more distant, preoccupied with her new duties as Marshal of Starlight Beacon. Or maybe he was the one who was preoccupied. Elzar had meditated on the vision day and night since the dedication. He could have gone to Avar to apologize and ask for her guidance, or if not her, then Stellan Geos, his oldest friend. But Stellan had duties of his own. He was a council member now, responsible for guiding the order as a whole. He would not have time. Besides, asking for help was hardly Elzar's style. Elzar Man was the one who solved problems, not posed them. He found solutions, answers, new ways of getting the job done. So Elzar did what he had always done. He tried to solve the problem alone. First, he had consulted the archives and over countless text files and holocrons in the collection, even going so far as attempting to decipher the mysteries of the Gagarin codes, the ancient grimoire whose text had confounded linguists for thousands of years. Even then, sitting in the archives, under the watchful gaze of the statues of the lost, Elir had heard the screams at the back of his mind, seen the faces of the slain in every reflective surface or passing Padawan. The Codex had brought him here, to Ashtala, Tython's primary moon. The ancients had called this stretch of land the Isle of Seclusion, which was exactly what he needed if he was ever going to fully understand what he had seen. He needed solitude, focus. The last straw had been receiving a message from Stellan's old master, the ES Team Durana Khan, congratulating him on his elevation to Jedi Master. Furthermore, the council had a posting for him. He was to be Marshal of the Jedi Outpost on Valo on the edge of the Rasik sector. Him? A Marshal? How could they be so blind? Couldn't they see he wasn't ready? Couldn't they see how troubled he was? Elzar walked toward the ocean, feeling the warm sand beneath his feet, discarding his outer robes as he approached the water. Yes, this was better. This was where he would finally see the truth, where he would finally understand. He didn't stop at the shore, but strode out purposefully into the waves, up to his knees, up to his waist. Soon he was swimming out in the sea, stopping only when he could no longer see land. He spun slowly, treading water, surrounded only by the sea and the force itself. It was time. Elzar took a deep breath and pushed himself down beneath the waves, eyes closed, water rushing into his ears, blocking every other sound. There was nothing. No revelation. No response. He kicked down again. Up, drawing air into his lungs before plunging back. I am here. I want to learn. I need to understand. Nothing changed. Where were the answers he'd been promised? Where was the understanding? He repeated the ritual, breaking for air, plunging back down, letting the ocean swallow him whole. And again, and it was like hitting an air pocket. All at once he wasn't sinking, he was running, his fellow Jedi at his side as nightmares snapped at their heels. They weren't in water, but in fog, thick, acrid, impenetrable. Nothing made sense, not the chaos, not the panic, not the fear. He opened his mouth to cry out, seawater rushing in from far away, from a different world, from a different time. And the force spoke with such strength that Elzar was thrown into a spin, images flashing past his stinging eyes like purple lightning. The Thalothian Indira Stokes? No, one of her tendrils was missing, an unfamiliar face contorted in rage. Where? Where? Elzar's shoulders heaved, seawater spluttering from his lungs. He was back on Ashla's shore, salt drying on his skin, baked by the burning sun. He looked around, eyes still blurry, trying to focus on the golden sands that stretched out to either side of him, wing moths circling in the sky above, ready to pick the flesh from his bones. But he wasn't dead yet. None of them were. He pushed himself up and stumbled back toward his vector, gathering his robes as he went. He needed to get off Ashla, needed to leave the core. Force had spoken. It had already answered his question, if only he had listened. One name, a planet where he would finally be able to put things right. Valo. Chapter 1. The Riston Badlands. No spacer entered the Riston Badlands lightly. The ice field was filled with a twisted wreckage of cruisers that had attempted to run the gauntlet of colliding planeroids and failed. On a good day, it was a dangerous, idiotic endeavor. On a bad day, it was suicide. Today was a very bad. The squall spider bucked as it weaved through the spinning rocks. The craft was small, barely larger than a shuttle, but it was fast and as maneuverable as any of the Jedi's famed vectors. In fact, anyone watching the strange arachnid-like craft could have been forgiven in thinking that a Jedi sat at the controls. Who else could have negotiated the ever-shifting starscape, weaving left and then right to avoid being pulverized by giant balls of ice? But the being in the pilot's seat couldn't have been further from a Jedi. The Jedi were the defenders of life, and light the galaxy over. They lived for others, never for themselves, maintaining peace and harmony wherever they roamed. In short, they were heroes. Udi Dis, on the other hand, had been born a Talordal, but now only identified as a Nihil. As broad as he was tall, the avian had dedicated his life to piracy and plunder, taking what he wanted and decimating whatever was left. It wasn't a noble life, but it was the only one he knew, and it had given him a place in the universe that had repeatedly spat in his face. The only thing Dis had in common with the Jedi was his connection to the Force. Many Talortai were sensitive to the energy field that bound the universe together, but few of his species ever made use of it, the cowards. They said it wasn't their right, that to do so was somehow immoral. Dis had never understood why. If you were lucky enough to have abilities, shouldn't you use them, hone them to gain an advantage over those who didn't? This was why the majority of Talortai were doomed to remain where they were, scratching out a meager existence on Talar while he was out here in the stars. Sure, he had been let down many times, sometimes by others, most often by himself, but the Force had never betrayed him, not once. Life would have been better if he hadn't gotten himself addicted to Redug, but for now, he was sober and had never felt so alive. Dis clutched the controls with clawed hands, his muscled arms bunching as he slew the spider sharply to starboard, skillfully avoiding the debris that, with a lesser pilot at the helm, would have killed everyone on board. Dis knew the Badlands like the back of his feathered hand, even though he had never flown them before. All Talortai had an innate sense of direction, feeling the vibrations of the cosmos in their bones, but Dis's navigational skills were off the chart. Thanks to his talents, he could feel the location of every asteroid in the field. He didn't. Behind him, the door to the spider's cockpit slid open, stale air gushing from the planet hopper's cramped corridors. Dis didn't turn to see who it was. There was no need. He heard the scrape of the boots on the deck plates, felt the swish of the cloak through the air, Dis's feet airs ruffling in response to the presence of the man he had pledged to serve for the rest of his life. Martian Ro, the Eye of the Nihil. Had he been surprised when Ro approached him about this mission? Of course he had. He had no idea the Eye even knew his name, let alone what he could do in the pilot's seat. Dis had spent the last few years serving on the cloud ship of a saw-mouthed Crocine who went by the name of Scarspike, a thug who spent more time abusing his crew than planning raids. And it showed. Dis had killed Scarspike after a botched attack on Sereno's funeral moon. They had lost 3 Nihil that day, but Scarspike had lost more, Dis opening his scrawny throat with a slash of a wing blade. Dis had no idea if the cloud slaughter had first brought him to the Eye's attention. Maybe, maybe not. All Dis knew was that he suddenly found himself elevated beyond the strikes and the clouds and all the Nihil's ranks to join Ro's personal retinue. His aggrandizement didn't go unnoticed. The Nihil had a strict hierarchy. You started as a lowly strike, working your way up to cloud and eventually to storm. The Nihil horde was organized into 3 tempests, each commanded by a tempest runner. There was Paneta, towering Daotin with ideas above his station, the cold and efficient Twi'lek Lorna D, and the latest appointment, a scheming Talpini known as Zitar. It was fair to say that the Talpini promotion had put Pan's squashed nose out of joint. Dis's sudden promotion had only indeed Dis had almost come to blows. The Haven scoffed. Ah, well, most of the time at least. Dis suspected that if it were AR, the pub's Pan would have went to spinning out of an air, ask me, but the navigational aids were too valuable. They VE the Nihil, the ED, so as concerns all on deaf ears. Des was welcomed aboard Ruskvas Ragus the gas, which was largely maintained by a crew of silent droids, its many chambers empty, like a palace with no occupants. It was here, in Rock Inner Sanctum, that Dis had learned they were heading to Ristan on a private mission. They could have taken the Gon, of course. The ship rarely left the Nihil's base on Grisal, and even then split itself into a smaller second airy craft that left the bulk of the gauge behind. But even that would be too cumbersome to make it through the ice field in one piece. They needed something smaller. They needed the Spall D. How long until we clear the Badlands? Ro asked, resting a gauntleted palm on the back of Dis's seat. Just a few minutes, my... Dis swiveled in his chair to face his leader. I still don't know what I should call you. My eyes rose, thin lips curled at the obvious distaste in Dis's voice, his dark eyes glinting in the red light that streamed in through the viewport. You can call me Marfian. Dis's chest swelled. He had never been one for the chain of command, which was probably why he had stayed a strike for so long. That and the fact he'd spent most of the last decade in a redug stupor. Now look at him, on first-name terms with Ro himself. No one called the Eye Martian, not even Pan. I still think it would have been easier to use a path, Dis said, Phenom bringing the spider out of the ice field to slingshot around Rystank Weak Star. Ro walked over to the vacant gunner station to recover his mask, which had remained on the console, ever since they had left the GRE hall, wiping the mask's frosted visor with his sleeve. You're every bit as impressive as your heritage suggested you would be, especially now that you're free from your affliction. What little Yeah, he was free all right. Rowe had made Distro Main of his stash into a trash compactor back on board the Gaze. His mind was clear for the first time in years, his connection to the Force stronger than ever. There was no way he could have made it through the ice field when he was on Reed. He owed Rowe so much. And to think we had a Force user in our midst all these years, Rowe continued, checking the filters of his mask. Scarspike was a fool. I'm glad he's dead. You're not the only one, this thought, but kept the thought to himself as the spider dropped into Riston's thin atmosphere. Have you ever been to a tidally locked world? Rowe asked. Dish shook his head. They're fascinating, the eye told him. One face constantly angled toward the sun, its surface little more than charred desert, while the others are frozen. Wilderness, Dish said, the blasted terrain not inspiring much confidence. So where do we land? Rowe pointed at a band of barely habitable land that ran between the two extremes. There. Is there a spaceport? Not exactly. Rowe directed them to a patch of barren ground, clumps of rollweed tumbling across the wasteland. Are you sure this is the place? This asked as the landing gear deployed. There's nothing here. Rowe merely smiled as he slipped his mask over his head. Oh, you'll be surprised. Chapter 2. The Cycler Shipyards. Not long ago, Padawan Bel-Zettifar would have been excited by the sight that stretched out beneath him. He was standing on an observation platform in the largest hangar he had ever experienced, just part of the vast shipyards that orbited Cycler, a relatively small green and brown planet in the mid-rim. Below, gleaming bright in the hangar's floodlights, was the vision and polished durasteel known as the Innovator. The starship, now hours from launch, was a Technolog Cal Marvel, over 300 meters, long and bristling with the latest scientific and medical equipment. The Innovator was quite simply the most sophisticated research vessel ever built. A fact its designer, the famed Equalish engineer Vam Targis, had told Bell himself when he had arrived at the shipyards. It runs on a network of no fewer than 42 Intellex-grade droid processors, don't you know? Targis had informed him as they strode through the ship's vast operations center on a whirlwind tour. The engineer's vocoder whirring excitedly as it translated Vam's native Equalish to basic. That's very impressive, Bell had offered, uncertain terms that it was considerably more than that. It was outstanding. The entire network is supported by a multi-motion framework of my own design, one that rivals the Jedi archives on Coruscant, if I do say so myself. Bell didn't know if that was true, but he hadn't wanted to contradict the engineer. This was Vam's moment, after all, or rather it would be when the Innovator arrived on Valo in a couple of days. The ship was to be a showpiece at the upcoming Republic Fair, the latest of Chancellor Lina So's great works. Soon, millions of festival goers would be marveling at Targis' achievement, and if they were anything like Bell, they would be dazzled. The Innovator boasted state-of-the-art cybernetic workshops alongside multiple bioengineering labs, analysis stations, research facilities, and a medical library second only to the Dosha Institute on Dunnock. But as extraordinary as the craft undoubtedly was, it was still nothing compared with the beings who had constructed the ship rivet by rivet. The Cyclorians were a wonder, unlike anything Bell had seen before. Insectoid in nature, they stood about a meter in height with large bulbous heads dominated by a pair of large compound eyes, much like the heat flies that had buzzed through the halls of the Jedi outpost on Elphrona where Bell had received most of his training. He watched as they swarmed across the glistening hull, completing final checks, each Cyclorian working in unison with their teammates without seeming to utter a single word. It was incredible. Each seemed to know exactly what job needed doing instinctively, none of them getting under one another's feet, each perfectly complementing the next. And the enthusiasm for their work was infectious. In the 24 hours since he had arrived, Bell hadn't seen a single Cyclorian comp. Beside him, Ember stirred. The Charhound had been sitting patiently at his feet, Bell's constant companion since they had left Elfrona. The dog had started life as a stray that had been adopted by the Elfronian Jedi, becoming something of a mascot at first and a loyal friend ever since. When Bell had left Elfrona, Amber had simply hopped into his vector, her intention of staying by his side clear. She had been there ever since, his guardian and confidant. Now she was on her feet, looking expectantly at the door of the observation platform as it swished open to allow Indira Stokes entry. The aging Jedi laughed as Ember bounded over, jumping up onto the Thalothian's legs to be rewarded by a tickle beneath the orange-flecked chin. Yes, yes, Indira said. I'm pleased to see you too. Now down you get. That's it. Good girl, Samshi. But Ember obeyed, trotting back over to Bell where he had remained the edge of the platform. Bell looked down at her and smiled, the Charhound's excited tail thwacking against his boots. I'm sure she likes you more than she does me, he commented as Indira joined him. I think we both know that's a lie, she said, joining him to gaze down at the majestic craft below. She leaned against the railing, shaking her head at the spectacle of the Cyclorians hard at work. Stars above! It takes your breath away, doesn't it? Indeed it does, Master. The innovator is as impressive as those who constructed it. Beings. As always, Bell felt a pang as he addressed Indira by her title. It was true that the Lothian was his teacher now, having agreed to take on his training after his previous master, Loden Greatstorm, had been lost defending settlers against the Nihil nearly a year ago. Their last conversation played regularly through his mind, Loden at the controls of his vector. I'm not your master anymore, Bell. You're a Jedi Knight, not until the Council declares. And I want you there when it happens. Now that would never be. Loden had told him that he would see Bell soon and had never come back from the attack. No one knew what had happened when Loden had abandoned his vector, their vector, to save the Blythe family from the Nihil. The vector had been reduced to atoms by a Nihil cannon, and Loden, well, he was just gone. Indira constantly reminded Bell that Loden's final wishes had been for his Padawan to be knighted, but Bell knew he wasn't ready. How could he be when he felt so empty inside, like something was missing? Bell? He swallowed, suddenly aware that Indira was studying him, his new teacher, no matter how weird that felt, and it shouldn't. He'd known her for years, even fought by her side, and respected her more than Jedi alive, which of course was the problem. Loden Greatstorm wasn't coming back. That much had become blatantly clear, but no matter how much Bell admired Indira, she could never replace the noble Twi'lek. Any. Bell offered a weak smile. I was just thinking about how excited the crowd will be at the Republic Fair, seeing the innovator for the first time. They will. And what about you? What about me? Are you looking forward to Valo? He shifted uncomfortably, careful not to kick Ember, who was nuzzling against his legs, her pelt warm through his synth leather boots. It will be good to see Mikkel and Nib. And Burry, too, of course. That was all true. He'd come to think of all three as friends, especially the Wookiee Burryaga, whom he had gotten to know after serving together. Emag, a lump formed in Bell's throat as Indira continued. I can ein him standing here with us, watching the Cyclorians work, appreciating their skill. Bell's voice cracked as he tried to control his emotions. And what do you think he would say if he were here? The Thalothian pursed her lips. I think he would compliment you often, and on the sign of your holster buckle, tell you to smile, more point out that if you're ever going to master a lateral roll, you're going to have to log at least 2 more hours a day in your vector. A grin broke out on Bell's face, despite himself. The last part of the sentence was pure Indira, who always seemed happier in the sky than on her feet. He would also remind you how a Jedi faces the death of those they love, she continued, and Bell's smile immediately dropped away. Because Jedi can love, Bell, We're not droids, nor should we ever be. We are living creatures rich in the Force, with everything that brings joy, affection, and yes, grief. Experiencing such emotions is part of life. It is light, but while we experience such emotions, we should never let them rule us. A Jedi is the master of their emotions, never a slave. You miss what you might have shared with Loden if he were here. That is natural. I miss him too. And so we acknowledge that hurt. We understand it, even embrace it, but eventually, we let it go, Bell said, looking back at the innovator so Indira couldn't see the tears she must have known were in his eyes. The Thalothian reached out, placing a comforting hand on Bell's forearm. I didn't say it was easy, just like a lateral roll. That made him smile again, as did the slight squeeze she gave him before turning back toward the ship. Besides, no one has ever really gone. No matter what happens, Loden will be with you, now and forever. He's a part of all of us now. Through the Force, she agreed. You believe that, don't you? He nodded, hoping she was fooled while knowing full well that she wasn't. Yes, of course I do. I'm glad to hear it, she said, not sounding convinced. Now, unless there's anything else. We should get off this platform and actually do something with the day, he said, keen to bring the conversation to an end. Indira's comlink beeped before she could respond. Maybe the Force agrees with you, my not-so-young Padawan. Indira fished the comlink from beneath her tan-colored jacket and activated the channel. Stokes here. This is Stellan Geos, a voice crackled over the link. The Jedi Master's usually rich tones rendered tinny by the vast distance between them. While Starlight Beacon had improved communications on the frontier, the comm network was still stretched, to breaking point, even here in the mid-rim. Chancellor So had promised a complete line of beacons stretching from the core to the farthest reaches of the Republic. But until that pledge became a reality, they would have to cope with bouts of static that frequently drowned out communications. Apologies, but can you repeat that? Indira was forced to say as the rest of Master Geos's greeting distorted beyond recognition. For of course, he complied. I was just checking on your progress, my report to the Council. Will the innovator be ready to launch on time? As he realized, ahead of schedule, Bell cut in, before blushing had spoken when the question was directed at his master. Indira made a show of rolling her eyes, although the smile on her lips told. Then I look forward to seeing it for myself, and to finally, of course, Nib Asek has been singing your praises. You, Bell's blush deepened. She's with you? On our way to Valo, yes. She's looking forward to seeing you again. Self, she is too kind, he stammered, not knowing what to do with him. And my Padawan is too modest, even for a Jedi. Indira, cut in the Force, has blessed him, as you will see for yourself, old friend. Bell's eyebrows shot up. He had no idea that Indira knew Geos, let alone that they were as close as her tone suggested. I don't doubt it, Stellan said. Until Valo, then. I hear the pickled Kushnip is to die for better than we ate on Theros Major. I'll be the judge of that. Stellan chuckled on the other end of the line. Why am I not surprised? Now, if you'll excuse me, I have an appointment with a cam droid. Well, it was Indira's turn to laugh. Well, if you get yourself promoted to the High Council, people will be asking for your autograph next. I'll send them your way instead. Geo's out. What's he like? Bell asked, as Stokes slipped the comlink back beneath her soft leather jacket. Stellan? One of the finest Jedi I've ever known. We met on Karagon Viner, long before I went to Elfrona. He's younger than me, of course, but... Indira paused, her white tendrils shifting slightly on her shoulders. Bell didn't have to ask why. He had felt it too, a cooling in the Force, its flame dimming just for a moment before burning brighter than before. Chapter 3. Safrifa, will you help us? Tyorik had lost count of the times she had heard those words, usually delivered with a side order of pleading eyes and, more often than not, missing limbs. You had to be desperate to approach someone like Tai. The swamp farmers of Safrifa were desperate. They had found her repairing her ship on the edge of the bog fields, preparing to leave after a successful extraction operation, where she had liberated the son of the local marsh lord from a rival clan. There had been blood and screaming, always blood and screaming. Some of the gore still caked her armor, while the screams would linger when she finally fell into her cot that evening, even after taking Kikon root to help her sleep. In all honesty, she didn't mind the screams. They had been her companion for the best part of a decade, the one constant in her ever-changing life. For the kids' safe return would. The Novian ore she had received come in handy. The ship needed parts, and parts meant money. She docked to the Novian offer, hands smaying it down to forge saw blades. Maybe she'd buy one herself, less money for the ship, but her arsenal had been depleted after that botched job on Also 3. Criffing Hoopaloo stealing half her stash. Other Emirs would have tracked down the traitorous parrot and ripped the smarmy beak clear from his face, but Tai wasn't any other Emir. Bad things happened, and you dealt with it. There was no point wasting time or effort on battles you didn't need to have, especially if no one was paying you. Crops. She had sensed the swamp farmers long before she heard them slosh through the bog. Sensed and assessed. They were no threat to Mir or beast, no threat to anyone. Most Saffir fans were scrawny little creatures with skin the color of stagnant water and hair that hung like pondweed in front of large oval eyes. They were industrious, though, ingenious too. Tide trudged through one of their floating beds, a long, narrow plot of thick soil raised from the marsh water by mud and decaying vegetation to stop the roots of their crew becoming waterlogged. The farm had stretched on for kilometers, each plot framed by willow trestles and surrounded by a network of narrow canals. At first glance, you would be forgiven for thinking that nothing could be grown here. But the Saffir fans had proved otherwise. Resourceful and resilient. Tai liked that, admired it even. Now they were here, waiting patiently to speak with her. It could only mean one thing. Nice ship, the warbling voice commented in broken basic. What'd it name? Doesn't have one, Tai replied in their native tongue, not turning around from her work. The damn stabilizer was hanging on by a thread. You speak our language? The farmer asked, surprised. Enough to get by. She was lucky like that. It had always been the same. Tai picked up most languages quickly, a useful talent in her profession. Sometimes she let people know. At other times she kept quiet and listened she had. Talk had failed. She hadn't been lying, though. Her ship, a battered VT 2.5 Phaeton, didn't have a name, only a registry number logged in the Republic records. Several numbers, actually, depending on the job or employer. She didn't see the point of giving anything a name ship, weapon, or even the two droids that assisted her on missions, a Sarkis the admin unit, and an admittedly useful astromech. Like the ship, they were tools, nothing more. Why form attachments to something that could never be attached to you? Maybe it was a throwback to her training. Maybe not. I just thought it was common sense. What do you want? She needed this conversation over. She had places to go, parts to buy. We have Novian. Not much. But enough. Enough for what? Instead of answering, the farmers offered a simple statement. It is killing our children. Tai stopped working, the all-kit tool dropping down from the exposed stabilizer core. What is? She asked, an air of resignation in her voice. A monster, a bad one. Was there any other kind? How long has it been happening? 3 weeks. We have laid traps but have smashed them. It wrecks our plots, ruins the crops. Haven Scott. Not much Novian if the size of the bag was anything to go by, hardly worth her time. It is killing our children. Where? In the Sorkin swamp, 3 days hike from here. 1, if you have a skimmer. Do you know? Have a skimmer? He looked at her and she looked at him. His companion looked at the marsh water, exhausted, without hope or expectation. Back in the day, she would have used a set of Verazine stones to make the decision, telling herself that she was leaving things to chance. to the will of the universe. One side of the stones was etched with moon symbols, the other suns. The process was simple enough. Throw them at the ground, decide whether you were banking on more suns or moons, and let fate guide your way. She'd been taking more of an active role recently, choosing her own path instead of relying on the stones, and right now she knew that the job wasn't worth it. She could get back in the ship and blast off for Kelduin. It was the sensible thing to do. Logical, even. He needed to say the words. Will you help us? And there they were. Cold had never worried Udi Dis. He had never experienced it growing up, but that had been so long ago now. The tropics of Talar, little more than a distant memory. There had been so many worlds since then, so many routes plotted and sold. His father would have been ashamed of the life his son had led, but what else was new? None of this stopped Dis's breath catching as the spider's ramp thudded down on the dusty ground. The cold was intense even here in Risten's habitable band, but Dis couldn't let it show. He wouldn't. He strode down the ramp wearing a fur-lined cloak and mask to protect his eyes from the wind, the metal clattering beneath his clawed feet, ignoring the chill that sliced through his feathers like a vibranic. There he is, croaked a voice as Ro himself exited the craft. Dis dropped into a defensive position, his grip on his wing blades tightening, the curved weapons the only possession he still had from home. The bundle of furs was rushing toward them, leading a trio of large creatures that looked like escapees from a bio to Splicer's nightmare. A hideous mix that was part blurg and part bantha. Not for the first time. The kinesthesia that allowed him to navigate the stars with such precision extended to the Jedi's fabled premonition, a sense of danger before it struck. For all he knew, those thick pelts hid a disintegrator or laser flail. He flinched as Ro's hand settled on his shoulder. At ease, soldier. That's our contact. Soldier. It had been a long time since Dis had been a soldier. It had been a long time since Dis had been anything. Long before he found the Nihil. Ro strode past him, stepping off the ramp as the newcomer threw her arms wide. March on, march on, march on, she wheezed with familial joy. You have come back to us. Finally, you have returned to the path. Kufa, Ro responded, but he made no attempt to return the embrace that the old woman so obviously desired. Instead, she let her arms fall to her swaddled sides once more, content to grin at the man who had unleashed a reign of terror on the outer rim. It is good to see you, cousin. Another surprise. Was this crone, with her leathery skin and toothless smile, a relative of the Eye himself? Dis knew little about Ro's past, save for the fact that he had inherited the title of Eye from his father, Asgar. Beyond that, no one knew much about Ro's lineage, or even his species with their slate-gray skin and pitch-black eyes. And yet there was something in the face of this woman, with its strange tattoos so similar to lightning bolts of the Nihil, that was familiar, even if Ro looked like he could snap her like a barium reed. We have missed you, the woman said, gazing up at the Eye. When we received your message, the elder barely believed it. He trailed off, lifting a shaking finger to his mask. Ro allowed her to touch it, another first as far as Dis knew. Although I would rather see your face, it's been so long. Ro guided her hand back down, holding it warmly in his hands. Later. When we are in the shrine, that, at least, seemed to placate her for the time. Yes, the shrine. Although the temperature will be worse, not better, I can well believe it, but it will be worth it. To look upon the leveler, to feel its nullifying peace, as our ancestor did long ago, as we were taught, all of us. Tears shone in the old woman's dark eyes. Dis wondered if they would freeze. You have truly come back from the darkness. Ro released her hand. You will take us then. Kufa's gaze shifted to Dis, as if seeing him for the first time. And who would you bring to the fields of Golomaran? Who would you bring to the shrine? This is Udi Dis, Ro told her, raising a hand in Dis's direction. A, a friend, Dis liked that. Not a bodyguard, not even just a pilot. A friend. The old crone's eyes bored into him. He is. What? Dis wanted to yell that he was freezing. He is Palotai, Ro answered for him. A species strong in the force. Her eyes flicked back to her cousin's masked face. The force? This time Dis spoke up. I am a navigator. A pathfinder, she chuckled, obviously amused by his choice of words. Are you now? Well, whatever you are, whatever you can do, you are welcome. Again, he glanced up at Ro, as were the credits that came before you. Such generosity. For you, Ro said. Do? The open hand? Yes, I do. Half devoured by rust weevils, but she still flies, although not to the shrine. She patted the hide of one, of the shaggy beast that waited patiently beside her. The Slarga will get us where no transport will fly. They are strong. She glanced back at Ro. They have to be. Where we're going, the ride to the cave entrance was long and arduous. Thankfully, the first part of the journey had been taken by hoversled, the Slarga snorting at the back of the speeder that coughed and spluttered as it traversed the Golomaran ice flats. The landscape was barren, a frozen waste stretching out into darkness in all directions. Out here, in the tundra, Dis was grateful for the thick pelts that Kufa had supplied. The stink of stale sweat clung to the matted fibers, but they kept the wind from freezing his bones, as Ro perched up front with his cousin. On Vorlong, Kufa announced they must go the rest of the way on Slargabek. They swayed into the gloom, the light from the hoversled diminishing as its droid pilot sped away as fast as its struggling repulsor lift would allow. The dark was almost absolute, and their yet Beerus caravan continued in silence, any sound swallowed up by the howling gale that threatened to pluck them from their mounts. Somehow, the Slarga knew where they were going, thick heads held down against the wind, wide feet crunching into the snow. Dis reached out with his senses, satisfied that Ro was still in front of him, and trusting that the old woman knew where she was going. He had to stay alert. There was no knowing what terrors hunted the ice flats, if any life could survive such temperatures in the first place. But if it could, it would be hungry, and the Slarga would make for a good meal, as would they. Even old Kufa, whom Dis imagined was little more than skin and bone beneath all those furs. After an hour that seemed like a day, Dis's mount lurched to a halt, and for a second he wondered if it had succumbed to the cold and was ready to collapse onto its flat, brutish face. He heard boots crunch into the snow ahead. Ro had dismounted and was helping the old woman down from the lead Slarga. Dis followed suit, grateful for the glow rod that Kufa ignited, waving it northeast of their current position. They battled against the wind, the light from Kufa's glow rod blinking on and off as snow sheeted between them. Soon Dis couldn't sense the Slarga they had left huddled together, let alone see them. There was nothing but snow, and ice, and wind, and noise. His body ached, his wing blades heavy from where he had hefted them on his back, every step a trial in itself. Time lost all meaning, and Dis feared on more than one occasion that his senses had abandoned him. Which north? Which was south? Was Ro even still ahead of him? He called out, but couldn't even hear his own voice, let alone if the eye had replied. Wait, was. Then suddenly, he stopped. His senses returned to him. Kufa and Ro had paused, and Dis forced his usually keen eyes to focus through the grime plastering his goggles. The old woman had led them to a rocky outcrop in the ice, her glow rod illuminating a cleft in the petrified stone, barely wide enough for a monkey lizard to squeeze through. And yet, that was exactly what she was doing, her furs snagging on the rocks. Dis thought she was going to get caught, but she squeezed through the gap like a screw rat sliding through a crack half its size. In a second, she was gone, and Dis felt a sudden sting of panic that she had taken the glow rod with her, until he realized the illuminator was in Ro's hand. The eye offered the rod to him, intending to follow his cousin, but Dis shook his head. The old woman seemed to know where she was going, but there was no telling what was waiting for them on the other side of that cleft. This wasn't about to let Ro push himself into the arms of a frost spider. Drawing his wing blades, Dis followed the crone into the unknown. Chapter 5. The Cyclo Shipyards. Vam Targes' bristled head snapped up from a terminal as Indira and Bell ran onto the Innovator's spotless flight deck. Jedi? There's a problem, Bell blurted out before Indira could stop him. Targes' mandibles chattered in concern. What kind of problem? Bell inwardly cursed himself. We don't know. We felt a disturbance in the Force, Indira cut in to spare the young Jedi's blushes. And you can't be more specific? Aquilish asked through his vocoder before correcting himself. No, of course you can't. The Force is hardly empirical because that would be, useful. Both Jedi had gotten used to Vam's nature. The Aquilish meant no disrespect. He was used to absolutes, components, equations, the laws of physics. While much of the galaxy trusted the Force, to those of a scientific mind, its vagaries must have been intolerable. The engineer turned to a nearby cyclorian at a bank of analysis consoles. Run a diagnostic sweep. The insectoid chittered a question in a language that Bell had tried and failed to pick up since he had been back in the mid-rim. All systems, Vam snapped in reply. If the Jedi say something is wrong, then something is wrong, and we need to find it immediately. The cyclorian's skin flushed purple as it went to work. While Bell hadn't mastered their language, he had learned enough about the INS sectoids to know that the sudden change in color indicated deep stress. He hated causing discomfort to anyone, but the shift in the Force had been so pronounced. He reached out again, visualizing the Force as a raging fire, silently asking Loden to help guide him. As ever, there was no response from his former master, but there was no mistaking the sudden breeze that fanned the flames he saw in his mind. It's not on the ship, he muttered under his breath. What was that? Vam asked. The threat doesn't come from within, but without. Indira confirmed as a klaxon wailed. Ember ran at Bell's feet as they raced to the flight deck's central control table. What is it? Bell asked. The hyperspace proximity alarm, Vam replied, his clawed hands flicking switches and adjusting controls. It's an experimental system I've been perfecting that monitors vibrations in real space to predict the arrival of craft from hyperspace. I was hoping to present it to Chancellor Lorceau herself at the fair, and, Bell prompted, are there vibrations? There's a siren, isn't there? But where are they coming from? Indira asked, ignoring the Aquilish's exasperated tone. Still in the X. Perhaps we can help, Indira said. Do you have a range of coordinates? Of course, Vam said, flicking a switch. A series of numbers scrolled down a screen set into the table. The Aquilish frowned. What's wrong? Bell asked. Sugtarges jabbed a button, and they turned to see the space surrounding the shipyards displayed on the main view screen. The data the opening will appear in one of these locations, but no one in their right mind would jump this near a gravitational body. There must be something wrong with the calculation. Yes. As if to prove him wrong, or rather his calculation correct, a chip appeared on the screen, jolting into real space. It was a junker, patched together from a number of different vessels, although Bell guessed that it had started life as a Corellian deep space cruiser. But no civilian ship would boast such armaments. Turbo lasers, blaster cannons, torpedo arrays, and even this display of raw strength paled into insignificance against the threat of the 3 lightning bolts that were slashed across the craft's blunt nose cone. They meant only one thing, denial. Indira was already running, Bell and Ember keeping pace. Scramble all skywings, she commanded. And tell me this flying laboratory has weapons. We're a scientific vessel, Vam shot back. Besides, it's just one ship. The Nihil never come alone, Bell shouted back as he jumped into the waiting turbolift. Do they know we're here? On the Neo cloud ship, the seething lump of Gluven hate known as Sarn Starbreaker eyed the shipyards hungrily. Well, he demanded wetly when no one responded to his question. A bulb-headed Flugrian at the comm terminal cocked her head, listening to the device crammed into her tiny ears. No, all. I'm picking up frenzied chatter on all frequencies. They right, good Starbreaker thought. That meant they were scared. He liked it when they were scared. When they were scared, they made mistakes. Any distress calls? Not any that can get past our jammer. Starbreaker grinned, his slime-covered face glistening with anticipation. Perfect. Target the shipyard and fire. His crew didn't have to ask what weapons. They knew their cloud well. When Sarn Starbreaker said fire, he meant all the weapons. Every single one. Scarlet beams lanced from the cloud ship's laser banks, followed by a barrage of plasma torpedoes. Explosions bloomed across the hangar's defenses, each prompting an excited gargle from the cloud. Cycler's shipyards were full of fresh pickings, but Starbreaker only had piggy little eyes for one prize, the treasure that lay within Hangar 22, the pride of the Republic Science Corps, the Innovator. He had enjoyed torturing the security officer who had finally given up the hangar number, but he would enjoy cracking open the Innovator's hull even more. He had no idea what treasures would be found when his raiding party rampaged through its corridors. In fact, he barely cared. He just knew they would be valuable, not to him, but to his Tempest. This would be the hit that would finally see Panetta promote him to Storm, with all the glory and riches that came with it. Sarn licked his lips, savoring the bitter tang of his own mucus. Yes, this would be glorious. We have a breach, the Flugrian reported. Starbreaker didn't know her name, but she answered to you, which was good enough for him. Switch on his. Then launch the fighters, he growled, flicking a command chair that sent his voice booming through the cloud ship. Feed the storm, my friends. We will feast well tonight. The Innovator's landing bay bucked as another salvo hit the hangar. The Nihil weren't wasting any time. Bell raced over to his Vector. Pop pinged the canopy with a nudge from the Force just as Indira had shown him. Ember scampered up one of the fighter's blade-like wings, jumping into the back seat as Bell leapt up to land perfectly behind the flight controls. He glanced over to see that Stokes was already aboard her own Veeder and running through her pre-launch sequence. Not that the tiny craft needed much in the way of flight checks. Each Vector was a symphony of simplicity, with little, if any, need for computer equipment or sensors, not when it had a Jedi behind the yoke. Argus' voice crackled over the comm as the Vector's canopy clicked shut over him. They've breached the hangar. Fighters incoming. Bell was impressed. The Equalish was keeping himself remarkably calm, all things considered. Any word from the Corps? We can't get through. All transmissions are being jammed. Bell didn't have to look to see if Indira was ready. He could sense it. He fired his thrusters, the Vector streaking toward the bay doors. When she had taken over his training, Stokes had insisted that Bell fly a Vector of his own rather than co-pilot, a decision that suited him well. Unlike the Nova, however, he had resisted giving the tiny fighter its own name. It hadn't seemed right. Not after Loden. The Jedi teachings were correct. No attachments. They just got in the way. Behind him, Ember barked once as they cleared the doors and shot into space. You all right back there, girl? Bell shouted over his shoulder. Ready to crew the blasters? No, that wasn't true. There was him. Smaller fighters had swarmed out of the main Nihil ship, darting soured the shipyard. Bell picked out a ragged-looking hopper barely any larger than the Vector, its stubby wings laden with laser cannons. Bell didn't need a targeting computer or a holosight. He only needed the Force. His thumb brushed the trigger on his flight stick, and the emitters fired, deadly beams finding their target and slicing deep into the Nihil's hull, rupturing the fighter's fuel line. The hopper erupted into starlight. Behind him, Ember yapped and Bell smiled, pleased with the strike. The next one's yours, girl. Indira Stokes' voice came over the comm, the Vector automatically switching to a Jedi-only channel. Careful, Padawan. Do not glory in the death of your enemy. That way leads to the dark side. Bell felt a sudden flash of resentment, which he instantly fought to quash. Indira was right. He had felt satisfaction at the Nihil's demise, satisfaction that was fueled by the feelings he tried so hard to ignore. Anger, grief. He still had much to learn. Thank you, Master, he said, sending the Vector into a spin to avoid fire from another fighter. May the Force be with us. Her own. For light and life, Indira replied. Engaging an enemy of the fighter was on Bell's tail, the pilot firing indiscriminately, gambling that sooner or later they'd get lucky. Bell kept spinning, creating a moving target that was 10 times harder to hit. Any other time, away, using the Force to switch channels to thank pilot he'd sensed zeroing in on the Nihil's tail. The local defense. You're welcome, came a synthesized voice in reply. Do you want to let us handle the fighters while you take on that beast out there? Bell glanced to his left as the owner of the voice brought his Z-29 Skyhawk alongside the Vector. The pilot was a Cyclorian, gloved fingers wrapped around the controls. Bell thanked the Force for the translator unit that was making sense of the insectoid's chirps and clicks, not to mention the starfighter at its controls. The Z-29 was the latest of a fleet of Skyhawks produced at the shipyard. The Incom Corporation had already signed a number of lucrative deals to supply Skyhawks to the world throughout the Republic and beyond. You didn't need the Force to sense the pride in the pilot's voice. He knew that this battle, although dangerous, would be a chance to show off the Z-29 speed and maneuverability. The Nihil had made a mistake attacking one of the fine shipbuilders in the mid-rim, especially with 2 Jedi present. Ember barked, and Bell laughed. I stand corrected. 2 Jedi and a Charhound. Sometimes. Might as read good dog that sure was he. Jedi Zetafar? Bell apologized to the waiting pilot, telling him to proceed as had suggested. The Cyclorian peeled off with a wave of his antenna, rejoining his swarm mates in the battle of their lives. Bell looked around, scanning the space around the hangar. Moss. I'm with you, Padawan, Indira responded, her Vector at his starboard wing. And the Force is with us all. Bell banked to port, angling away from the stricken hangar. In matched his bearing perfectly, turning with him as they sped to their new target, the Nihil cloud ship. Chapter 6. Safrifa. As the monster dragged her ever closer to the stinking wound of its mouth, Ty's only thought was that the cricking thing had more teeth than was strictly necessary. She could have guessed it was going to be a Drengir. A year ago, she'd never even heard the name before. No one had. But now the damn horrors were everywhere, bursting from the ground on just about every planet along the galactic frontier. When she had first heard one described, Ty had sniggered. Sentient plants? Seriously, how in Void's name could a plant be a threat? That was before she had seen one Faceto-gnarled face, a hideous mound of writhing branches with spurs of knotted wood. Tales of infestations spread as fast as the monsters themselves, whispered in hushed tones in 1,000 watering holes or huddled around campfires. Entire worlds were said to have been lost to the Drengir blight, settlements strangled by their barb, vines and populations consumed. Nothing seemed able to stop them once an infestation had taken root. Even the huts were said to have suffered. The teeming metropolises of Nal Hutta all but transformed into Seath jungles. Tall tales? Some folk dismissed such reports as nonsense. Taught her, the grizzled old merc investor crew of his band. Know where your limits are. Know where to draw the line. Of course, Karatu's line had involved betraying anyone who trusted him. But the lesson had remained with her, long after the Kirk had made the mistake of turning his back on her. Ty's rules were clear. No attachments, no complications. She hunted only animals, not sentient life forms, unless of course the sentient life was trying to kill her. The Drengir was definitely trying to kill her. She pushed back, sending a telekinetic wave against the creature strong enough to break the neck of an Acklay or maybe even a Rogwart. But not a Drengir. Never a Drengir. Did they even have necks? This wasn't her first encounter with the monsters. The first had nearly killed her. It had been on Galadron during a hunt for a Batarican. She'd found the serpent, Drengir roots crammed into the snake's and nasal cavities, its body leached of all nutrients. Unfortunately, most of the locals had suffered a similar ghastly fate, the infestation out of control. Ty had barely escaped with her life, although KL-03 had been more concerned that they'd lost yet another commission. Griffin droid. Next time it could take down the monsters, if there was a next time. A Drengir root crept up the side of her face, slithering toward her mouth, thorns scraping across her lips. Oh no, she wasn't going that way. Ty pushed again. If she couldn't break the Drengir's non-existent neck, she could at least break these damn feelers. The Drengir roared, its vines stretching beyond the point of no return. Finally they snapped, the Drengir's mound-like body slamming into a tree. Ty yanked the root from her mouth, wincing as the thorns sliced through her bottom lip. Another scar to add to the collection, another chance to die of. Howe's thoughts, images drawn, to overwhelm despair flooding her mind, or entire worlds reaped for the sustenance that's all she was to them. All anyone was. Food, meat, sustenance, survival. The Drengir surged forward, sending out creepers to snag trees and branches, anything to drag itself closer. Good. That meant it struggled to move on its own. Ty didn't know much about the Drengir, no one did, but she knew that meant it was young, and young Drengir were still vulnerable. At least, that was the theory. Ty leapt, higher than it should have been possible for her or any Philothian to jump. She didn't make it to the canopy of Karenga trees, but managed to grab a low-lying bough that stretched from one tree to another. The branch bowed, dropping her perilously close to the Drengir, the creature bellowing in hunger. The harvest is ours! The harvest is ours! Not today. Hooking her boots around the branch, Ty clambered directly above the creature. Her body ached, and the silver tendrils that hung from her scalp itched, even the phantom one. Especially the phantom one, sliced off all those years ago by a Weekie knife. If the missing tip was itching, she really was in trouble. The branch dropped. Ty whipped her head around to see that the Drengir had managed to snare the end of the bough and was pulling down sharply. She was caught in the middle, too far from the vine to try to kick it free and not close enough to the trunk to climb higher. The branch groaned, its wee bark starting to splinter. If it broke, there would be nothing to stop her tumbling down into the Drengir's embrace. Hung face down toward the Manzi, lasping back up toward her. Ty closed her eyes and reached down, not with her hands, but with her feelings, with her very spirit. She reached beyond the creature that longed to consume her and beyond the water that pooled beneath its ravenous bulk. She searched through silt and roots, looking for the one thing that could save her, the weapon she had dropped when the Drengir first attacked. There it was, caught beneath a root, right beneath the Drengir's weight. Damn and blast. A barbed vine looped around her left wrist. Ty reached out again, this time not searching, but calling. Beneath the Drengir something shifted, something Ty had owned for a long, long time. From long before Galadron. Before even Keraton, she increased the pressure. The muscles in her arms taut. Still it wouldn't come, twitching in the muck, unable to break free. Another creeper found her right wrist. The Drengir pulled her closer. Ty visualized her weapon in her mind, its long grip, the vicious spikes that would have so disappointed the old Azimel who taught her to build it. The focusing lens, the emitter, the activation switch. Purple light flared beneath the Drengir, and Ty pulled up with all her might. The blade sliced through the root. It was free. Next, it sliced through the Drengir itself, splitting that hideous beak-like mouth in two. The Drengir wailed as the two halves of its body came apart like rotten fruit, splashing into the mark. Ty's lightsaber found her hand, and the branch broke, She tumbled down, flipping to land in the middle of the Drenger's remains. She killed her blade, wiping mud from the hilt before slipping it back into its holster. Slowly, she pried the vines from around, her wrist careful not to get seached. It wasn't over, that she knew from reports she had intercepted back and forth from Starlight Beacon. Cut a Drenger down and it would regenerate. All it needed was one tiny scrap of its former self. But Tai had promised the Sephifians they would be free of the thing and would be good to her word. Another old lesson from Creation, even if he hadn't believed it himself. New came the hard work, hacking the dormant Drengir into strips, hanging them from the branches of the nearest tree, and then waiting for them to dry out enough to catch light. She probably had enough fuel in the microflammer in her belt to start a small bonfire. That would be enough until every scrap was burned. The harvest was hers. The walk back to the Mark farm took longer than Tai wanted, especially stinking of charred Drenger. She had recorded the blaze on a hola, evidence of the kill now that the body was gone. The farmers were waiting for her, relief on their faces and their meager offering still in its Maligator purse. But that's not all that was waiting for her. Tai's hand dropped to her lightsaber when she spotted the spacecraft next to her own ship. A figure swept down its ramp, as tall as the Saprafans were short. Tai recognized the species, a Kuranu, with their smooth light purple skin and large pupilless eyes. The newcomer was female, wearing a pristine flight suit, a small spherical droid hovering at her elbow. The unit served only one purpose, to deliver an anti-bac solution into the Kuranu's palm whenever required. The species had almost a pathological fear of germs, which explained the look of disgust that she tried to suppress as she took in Tai's swamp-encrusted outfit. "You are Tai Yorick," she finally stated, the so-called saber for hire. Her tone was blunt and to the point, as functional as the tight smile she flashed in greeting. "It depends who's asking. My name is Mentessa Cheka.